remember back in the 1990s when it was a big fad to dress up in a black suit and tie and call yourself a professional. You want to know why I remember those times? Because I used to go to the video store. What movies did I rent? One of them was Reservoir Dogs. I'm Kevin Porter, and you're watching Video Rental Chaos. Let's just lay this one right out on the table. Reservoir Dogs is the reason I fell in love with movies. This movie has everything. Great writing, great actors, and tons of action. Reservoir Dogs, according to Empire, off their Wikipedia site, is the greatest independent film of all time. Before we get this episode started, don't mind dropping a tip-off for old Mr. Pink right here, or you might end up stuck in the middle with a razor blade and a missing ear. With that being said, let's jump right on into Reservoir Dogs. We open with 8 gangsters eating breakfast. During the conversation, we learn the identity of all the men. By the way, though, after a healthy conversation about Madonna being a whore and finding out who the hell Toby was. You got the main boss Joe and his son Nice Guy Eddie. The rest all use aliases as well. They're a bunch of gangster criminals about to rob a diamond store. So we have Mr. Orange, Mr. Blonde, Mr. White, Mr. Blue, and Mr. Pink. When I said earlier that this movie made me literally fall in love with cinema, it's this opening scene right here. Smoking cigarettes, all in black suits. It made you want to make films just like this one. We come back to Mr. Orange being shot the fuck up, with Mr. White trying to comfort the poor bastard as he's scared to death of dying. They soon get back to the rendezvous point. Mr. Pink shows up and lays it all out that, hey man, they have a rat in the group and they were set up. Mr. Blonde had gone psychotic and shot up a bunch of the hostages. But he was able to note that the cops were there as soon as Mr. Blonde opened fire. Mr. Pink does break the news that he was at least able to get some of the diamonds that they were after. But he had stashed them elsewhere, as he had one hell of a time getting back there. Plus, if there's a rat in the group, he has no idea if the place is bugged. They are sure that Mr. Brown is dead, but not sure what happened to Mr. Blue or Mr. Blonde. They try to put a plan together because they're pretty sure it's not safe here anymore. Throughout the movie, we are filled in on the backstory of the characters. We understand that Mr. White has been friends with Joe for a very long time. Let's just say that Mr. White was all in. After a while, Mr. Pink and Mr. White are still mulling over what they should do at this point. They agree that since Mr. Orange did ask to go to the hospital and promised not to say anything, that probably would be the best move. Well, hang on there. It was the best move till Mr. Pink found out that Mr. White had dropped his first name and where he was from to Mr. Orange. This sets both Mr. Pink and Mr. White off into another screaming match, and eventually it turns physical, as this gives us some of the best dialogue in the movie. Mr. Pink and Mr. White gain their sense of composure and drill Mr. Blonde about what the hell is going on. Mr. Blonde, being his calm-natured self, lets the boys know that no one is going anywhere. Mr. White has a big fucking problem, okay? Things are about to get physical again real quick, but Mr. Pink jumps in and the fingers continue to be pointed at each other. Things again calm down and Mr. Blonde wants them to fall into his car as, he has a big surprise, or should I say, pig surprise. The dude kidnapped a cop and locked him in the trunk of his car. He lets the boys know that he talked to Nice Guy Eddie and confirmed that he is on his way down to begin to sort out this problem. We get the backstory for Mr. Blonde. Dude's been a friend with Nice Guy Eddie for years. He had just been released from prison after serving 4 long, hard years. Joe and Eddie love Mr. Blonde. He loves them. Since he's on parole, it really does limit what kind of activities he can get into, because he has some asshole parole officer. Nice Guy Eddie lays out a plan to get Mr. Blonde back on his feet. Before you know it, Eddie asks his dad about bringing Mr. Blonde in on the heist. Mr. Blonde lets them know that they are officially in business. The boys think that this cop will be able to give them some insight on who the rat is within this group. Eddie shows up and the boys aren't happy, and well, Eddie's not happy to say the least. It's said that Joe is on his way down here and he agrees to get Mr. Orange a doctor, but For right now, they need to get the diamonds that Mr. Pink stashed away and get the cars out of there. Eddie leaves Mr. Blonde in charge of the cop and Mr. Orange. Well, Mr. White is not happy about this as he thinks Mr. Blonde is a psychotic bastard. Mr. Blonde lays out to Eddie what happened in the store, and well, it seems that Mr. White finally does buy the case on why Mr. Blonde shot the place up. The dude just doesn't like alarms. Finally, we are to everyone's favorite part. What some call a straight up snuff scene. Mr. Blonde proceeds to tell the police officers that for no specific reason, he just gets off on torturing cops. Once you hear the classic song, Stuck in the Middle, pop on, you know the real fun is just about to begin. After I saw this scene, it's really hard to not hear that song and always think of this famous scene where Mr. Blonde uses a razor blade to cut off the cop's ear. Well, the next logical step after cutting off his ear is to get a gas can, right? Because it's time to barbecue this pig. But just as Blonde is about to light this swine on fire, Mr. Orange pops up out of nowhere and kills Mr. Blonde. We then confirm that Mr. Orange is in fact the rat in the group. He works for the LAPD. We get the entire breakdown of Mr. Orange going undercover with the help of his mentor. He learns a monologue to give himself an entire backstory for when he goes undercover. Cause you know criminals like to brag about their crimes. We get the entire breakdown of what happened before the beginning of this film. We are finally full circle. Nice guy Eddie, Mr. White, and Mr. Pink show back up and find Mr. Blonde dead. They begin to question Mr. Orange on what happened. Mr. Orange claims Mr. Blonde was going to do a burn, which he was, but apparently this burn goes against some sort of criminal code. Nice guy Eddie ain't buying it and unloads a clip into the cop. He knows that Orange is full of shit. All of a sudden though, Joe shows up and confirms that Mr. Orange is a rat and it's time for him to die. Mr. White, having bonded with Mr. Orange throughout this film, tells Joe that he is wrong, and boom, we got a Mexican standoff. Mr. White's gonna shoot Joe if he shoots Mr. Orange, and Eddie's gonna shoot Mr. White for shooting Joe. Mr. Pink, well, he tries to reason with them, but his words of wisdom are ignored, and boom, Joe and Eddie are dead. Mr. White is fucked up, but, well, he's still alive. Mr. Pink, being the only professional left, grabs the sack of diamonds and gets the hell out of Dodge. Mr. White cuddles up to Mr. Orange and, well, Mr. Orange lays it out that, well, he is a cop. Mr. White is like, motherfucker, and begins to cry. We assume that he gets shot up by the LAPD because, damn, what a twist. The first time I saw Reservoir Dogs was in 2004. I was a student in the video production class and I was 18 years old. This is when I first found out about Quentin Tarantino, specifically this film. I was at my buddy Josh Bryant's house and it was a group of us. It was decided that we would watch Reservoir Dogs and I'd never seen it before. I remember this experience watching this movie for the first time vividly. After watching it, it really transformed my thought process when it came to cinema. The dialogue is classic Quentin Tarantino, but most importantly, the actors in this film are what makes this so special. This is the very first time I ever saw Harvey Keitel. Talk about underrated, okay? Harvey Keitel, in my opinion, is one of the best all-time actors in Hollywood. His performance just draws you in. You throw in Steve Buscemi, Sean Penn, Tim Robbins, Lawrence Tierney, and Michael Madsen. All these actors brought such awesome performances to this film. It's one of those ensemble casts that just make you fall in love with what you're seeing on the screen. To this day, this stands as one of my top 5 films. Rewatching this film for this episode flooded my mind with the memory of why this movie played such an important role for me in my youth. I'll finish this episode with my love for K. Billy's super sounds from the 70s. As a person born in the 80s and raised in the 90s, the 70s always seemed so far away. In recent years, I have tried to consume anything from that decade to really start trying to get a feel for how that decade felt. Doesn't matter. Music and movies, hell, even old school sports games on YouTube. The 1970s is a fascinating time to revisit. Quentin Tarantino has always done a wonderful job with his soundtrack for his films. My final words are, if you haven't seen this movie in a long time, do yourself a favor and pop it in tonight. I don't think you're gonna regret this one. And until next time, we'll see you at the video store.